Spain closed 2025 with a GDP growth rate of 2.8%. On paper, this outpaced several European economies, suggesting a robust recovery. But that headline figure is heavily skewed. This expansion was driven almost entirely by adding more workers to the labor force and increasing total hours worked, rather than making the underlying economy more efficient. When we examine hourly productivity, the actual engine of wealth generation, it barely moved, creeping up just 0.9% annually. Because productivity is stagnant, real per capita wealth is falling behind the Eurozone average. This is a frustrated economic convergence, masked by employment spikes. Continuing to rely on public spending and demand-side stimulus as automatic responses to economic imbalances has reached its mathematical limit. It creates an illusion of prosperity while the foundational architecture weakens. The Atenea 2026 economic program provides a systematic reorganization of this architecture. It replaces reactive, short-term measures with a comprehensive institutional overhaul. The timeline for implementing these changes is rapidly shrinking. Over the next decade, Spain faces a hostile international environment, the return of strict European fiscal rules, and an imminent demographic shock. True economic convergence requires a pivot to supply-side economics. The focus must shift toward enforcing strict market unity, incentivizing private investment, and precisely redefining the boundaries of state intervention. Adjusting cyclical tax revenues or tweaking spending at the margins cannot absorb the scale of the challenges approaching in the 2026 to 2035 cycle. Delaying structural reforms at this stage is an active decision to accept permanent economic subordination and stagnation within Europe. To understand why the current growth model is exhausted, we have to isolate the specific vulnerabilities hidden beneath those positive cyclical tax collections. This matrix breaks down 4 interconnected constraints. First, a persistent structural deficit feeds into critical public debt, which sat at 100.7% of GDP at the end of 2025, including a massive €136 billion gap in Social Security alone. The third constraint is severely suppressed productivity. High regulatory burdens and a steep tax wedge on labor actively penalize companies from scaling up, locking the economy into a fragmented landscape of small, low-yield enterprises. But the most predictable threat is the fourth constraint: rapid demographic inversion and an aging population. The mass retirement of the baby boom generation represents a mathematical weight that the current labor force simply cannot support under existing rules. This demographic wave will trigger mandatory exponential increases in state spending on pensions, healthcare, and elder dependents. The record tax revenues Spain recently collected are cyclical and temporary. They are entirely insufficient to cover these permanent structural liabilities. Together, massive debt, stagnant productivity, and an aging population form a systemic bottleneck. They choke off organic expansion and guarantee a long-term decline in living standards if left untreated. Resolving these imbalances requires examining the rulebook that governs the economy. A major barrier to scaling businesses is legislative pluralism, the tendency to over-regulate economic activity at every level of government. Companies operate under a superimposed grid of state, autonomic, local, and European rules. This creates chronic legal insecurity and physically fragments the internal market. This web of administrative duplication costs the economy between 0.3 and 0.7% of total GDP annually. That represents up to €10.5 billion in sheer bureaucratic friction. The Atenea framework proposes absolute market unity as the default legal standard. Regulatory diversity must become a strictly justified exception, not the baseline. By applying the principles of subsidiarity and actual fiscal co-responsibility, regional administrations are held directly accountable for the costs of their specific regulations. Continuous, binding functional reviews of public expenditure can eliminate these redundant agencies and observatories without cutting a single essential public service. Regulatory homogeneity is a mandatory prerequisite for attracting capital necessary to drive productivity. Capital avoids friction, and right now, the Spanish market is defined by it. This reduction of administrative friction leads to a broader shift in how the government interacts with society. Over time, the state has assumed vast operational responsibilities, expanding its perimeter far beyond what the private economy can sustainably finance. The solution is a transition from a state that insists on directly providing every service to a guarantor state. This chart contrasts the two models. A guarantor state still ensures universal coverage and basic rights using public funding, but it introduces competitive private provision to maintain operational efficiency. Spain already has internal proof that this works. Administrative mutualism in healthcare successfully uses public financing while giving patients the freedom to choose competing providers, driving down overall costs. Applying this logic of freedom of choice and subsidiarity to education and the wider welfare state shifts power from government monopolies back to families and civil institutions. Shrinking the state's direct operational perimeter is the only mathematical method available to shield the welfare system from the impending demographic shock. Redefining the state's role is particularly urgent regarding Spain's most critical fiscal vulnerability, the pay-as-you-go pension system. The math is unforgiving. Relying solely on future immigration waves or further increasing social contributions will not balance the structural deficit created by retiring baby boomers. The Atenea program requires a progressive transition toward individual notional accounts, moving the system toward capitalization formulas that align payouts with actual contributions. Supporting this transition requires an entirely new fiscal philosophy, one that prioritizes supply-side economics and production over immediate redistribution. This includes simplifying the personal income tax into a flatter structure with clear family exemptions and making Social Security contributions completely transparent to the worker. By reducing the heavy tax wedge on labor and making corporate taxes more competitive, the system directly incentivizes businesses to scale up operations and hire new talent. When families are permitted to accumulate and protect capital across generations, they form a robust civil society that no longer relies on constant state intervention to survive. The Atenea program functions as a single integrated ecosystem where every reform technically reinforces the next. This diagram illustrates the necessary chain reaction. Lowering regulatory friction directly allows enterprises to scale, which immediately drives up hourly productivity. That high productivity environment generates the excess capital required to fund capitalization pension models, which in turn steadily deflates the sovereign debt burden. This interconnected sequence is the only viable path to executing a structural reduction of public debt without triggering a severe recession. Macroeconomic stability and rigorous fiscal discipline are absolute preconditions for any future growth. Relying on extensive employment growth and unchecked state expansion has lulled the economy into a false temporary sense of security. Sustainable growth requires a complete structural pivot, stripping away state monopolies to empower civil society, families, and private capital. The upcoming 2026 to 2035 cycle leaves zero margin for delaying these systemic changes. The pressure from debt and demographics is already locked in. The Atenea framework provides the definitive technical blueprint required to navigate this transition and restore institutional and economic stability. True convergence with Europe is impossible without committing to this supply-side, subsidiarity-driven institutional redesign.